Hi, this is Matthew from Aydus, and we're going to take a look at Google Analytics Enhanced E-commerce setup for Magento Enterprise. This is a feature baked into Magento Enterprise, not Magento Community, Enterprise version 1.14.2.0. But it's not as simple as just flipping a switch and turning this feature on, so we're going to take a look at why do we want it and how do we implement it. And we want it simply because it gives us additional analytics specifically for e-commerce that we don't get with standard Google Analytics out of the box. There's of course a lot of information available and published by Google, so definitely read up on that if you haven't already. So we won't go into that in detail, but we will take a look at some GA reports. So once implemented under e-commerce, we'll have access to additional reports and additional analytics. So we're taking a look at shopping behavior. Here we can see sessions with product views, add to carts, starting the checkout process, and transactions. So getting insight into that entire flow. Also notice that this is broken up by new and return visitors below. The checkout behavior report should look familiar. So this gives us insight into our one-page checkout. This is based on Magento's out-of-the-box standard one-page checkout and our different steps. This has typically been achieved by firing off custom page view events. There's a lot of information and articles online about how to do that in Magento. I've always thought that's a little dangerous because it inflates the number of page views. So this is actually baked into Google Enhanced. Skip past sales performance, that's self-explanatory, but was particularly interested in the product list performance report. So we have some custom lists here, so don't confuse those with standard Magento, but you can see catalog, search, related, cross-sell. So these are standard Magento lists, and interesting because we can see product views all the way through to clicks, add to carts, and finally purchase, and can see the performance of these lists. So for example, are related products successful? Are people viewing them? Are they adding them to the cart, etc.? And then we've got a few marketing reports that are useful. Promotions, so this hooks into Magento's promotional engine. You can see views, clicks, right through to transactions. We can see coupons. Product coupons isn't wired up, an affiliate isn't wired up, but in theory that could be custom. Magento has official documentation on how to set this up, but the reason for this screencast is it was difficult to follow, seemed incomplete, and had a lot of questions after reviewing this. A shout out to branchLABS. They published this information, which was very helpful in filling in the gaps and is a good read as well. The setup in Magento is straightforward. So under configuration, Google API, where we normally set up analytics, we have an additional option, Google Tag Manager. So we want to enable that, and we'll want to add our container ID. Everything else here you see is a default. And the Google Tag Manager container ID can be found here. Simply copy paste. I found it very helpful to set up both a Google Analytics and a Google Tag Manager development environment, and both systems make that very simple to do. So you can do all your work in a sandbox until you get it right, and then you can move that over to production. On the Google Analytics side, we go to e-commerce settings, make sure that e-commerce is enabled, enhanced e-commerce settings is enabled, and then fill out the funnel steps, and we saw how these are used in the checkout funnel report. So that's the easy part done. Now it's a little more involved, and that's setting up Google Tag Manager. Next steps are to set up our triggers and tags, and the Magento documentation does a reasonable job of this. If you're not familiar with Google Tag Manager, you may need to read through this a few times, and may also again be helpful to read through branchLABS that has a few more images, and I think between the two you should have a good start and a good base. I needed to talk to Magento support because after setting up tags and triggers, it was incomplete based on wanting all the reports that we just looked at in Google Analytics. And some of the gaps were product impression, product detail, and after reviewing the Magento code, it looked like that was implemented, but it wasn't documented. And Magento support explained that some of that is under the hood, but it's not yet supported or fully implemented. It was ambiguous. So what I did is I went next steps, and I'll show a code adjustment, but I added these additional triggers, these additional tags, and this is my complete list here. So triggers, everything Magento, and then tags, just refer to everything Magento, ignore mouse stats. Note that the Google Analytics page tracking tag is a requirement. It gives us our standard Google Analytics page tracking, and it also hooks into the data layer to give us our e-commerce tracking. Note that the fireon, this was documented as gtm.dom, custom trigger in the Magento documentation. That's different than the branchLABS documentation. I choose to go down this road, although I don't fully understand the implications. There's a big gotcha with the product impression and detail tracking tags that I've set up, and that's because these other events are interactive events. They're clicks, they're page views, and so when we're talking about bounce rate, somebody comes and they click or they see a page, that's a normal event. It doesn't count as a bounce. Now, if we were to just add the impression and detail tracking in the same way, it means that if someone was to come to your product page and receive a product impression and leave, it wouldn't be counted as a bounce, and I think it should be. So we've got this non-interaction hit true. That's important for both those tags. Just for reference, let me click into one of the triggers and also one of the tags, just so you can see how these are set up. Google Tag Manager's preview feature was invaluable, so turning that on and refreshing a page on your site gives you this kind of detail. We get to see specific tags that are fired, not fired. We can click into these tags, see additional detail, and right through the data layer. Magento is responsible for building this data layer and making it available to GTM. One of the reasons I decided to break out all the tags as suggested by Magento is because it gives you this granular level of detail for troubleshooting. It is possible to consolidate all the tags. I've seen people suggest that, but I found it just made this process much harder. Alright, so we've covered a lot of ground. A quick recap. We looked at reports in Google Analytics, why we want them. We configured Magento. We configured Google Analytics. We've configured and set up Google Tag Manager. And now unfortunately, it was necessary to go next steps and actually dig into Magento code. So you could stop with the Magento documentation and their tags, and you could get a certain number of reports. And I suspect that what I'm about to talk about is going to be supported in later versions of Magento. But we needed this now, and we'll take a look at that next. The Google documentation is very good, and a big part of the complexity is handled by Magento, and that's building the data layer. It's the data layer that makes the JSON objects available to Google Tag Manager that we hook into. And we can see all the data layer objects here, which should look familiar. They're equivalent to the reports that we were looking at the beginning. So if we were to take a look at product clicks, describes the object that needs to be on the page for GTM. So Magento does this heavy lifting, but Magento support said it wasn't officially supported, and one of the key reasons is we're actually looking at an override. But Magento essentially gave this piece, which was great, all that information, but neglected to implement the event callback. So this callback ensures that the JS runs to completion, and that once it has, it's then going to fire off the callback that's going to do the URL redirect. So any tag that I wanted to implement that wasn't part of Magento's documentation, I assumed was not supported, and I dug into the Magento code and essentially made sure that it was consistent with the Docker. So in this case, implemented the event callback. So based on that, everything seemed to be working properly. The other thing to be careful of is this is designed to work with Magento out of the box, but we're all running a certain number of customizations, and a common one is Ajax add to cart. So there is a add to cart event that needs to be fired, and Magento will do this, except not if we've overridden that functionality with an Ajax add to cart extension. But it's fairly straightforward. Documentation gives us the JS that we need to put onto the page for any of these events, and you can see here, just as an example, this is a piece of custom code that we injected into the Ajax add to cart process. So the more non-out-of-the-box Magento, the more difficult it is to set all this up. So for example, we are not using Magento search, we're using a third-party search, so that search page needs to be customized to fire off the right events. And we also wanted to track custom lists. We have some bestsellers, people also bought different upsell lists and wanted to track those separately, so that wasn't too bad. There's no easy way that we could find to just slip that in. There were really some ugly JS overrides, but hopefully this is just temporary until another version of Magento that supports all this and this becomes redundant. That's it. So hopefully this has filled in a few gaps, gives a little bit more insight into implementing Google Analytics enhanced e-commerce. Thanks so much for listening.